Morning, everybody. I just wanted to welcome everybody back to our third review lecture for AP World History. This is Mr. Quintana from G. Holmes Braddock Senior High School. I hope you and your families are safe. They're at home watching these lectures. And our lecture today is going to focus primarily on East Asia and on South Asia. So the countries we're going to look at today in terms of East Asia primarily are going to be China, Japan, and Korea. And then our big focus on South Asia, of course, will be India later today. So I wanted everybody to take a look at this map that we have here on our PowerPoint. And this is an image of China. So China, of course, some of the major features you'll notice about it are to the north, the Yellow River area, to the south, the Yangtze River area. China historically has always been known for its high population. And its high population has been able to be withstanding there due to the fact that China has always been an area of very fertile land due to the Yellow River to the north and the Yangtze River to the south. So millet and wheat was normally grown in the north, while rice cultivation dominated the southern area of China. And the production of rice in the south and millet and wheat to the north allowed the support for a very large population there in China. In addition, you'll notice some of the other features. So from the early Qin dynasty, the beginning of the construction of the Great Wall. And the Great Wall, of course, was built to protect from northern nomads that dominated the area of Mongolia. So at first, there were Huns that attacked during the 2nd century BC, all the way into the 2nd century AD. And later on, we'll be talking about the Mongols, who will also be a threat to the northern border of China. So China has always had their northern borders harassed by these northern nomads that were looking for resources. And typically these nomads would pillage and plunder towns in northern China. So the Great Wall was used as a defensive measure to protect against these attacks from northern nomads. The Great Wall was also a symbol of China's xenophobia. So China has always had this fear of foreign influences. And it's really rooted in the fact that they've always been attracted by these northern groups to attack them due to the extreme wealth that China has always had. So their xenophobia, their fear of foreigners was always rooted in the fact that they were threatened by these outside groups. In addition, the Great Wall itself was also a trade route. People could travel along the length of the Great Wall and be able to communicate and travel and trade products. And if we look closely at the city of Chang'an, which is now called Xi'an in China, this was the ending and beginning point of both the Silk Road, right? So the Silk Road went starting in Chang'an all throughout Western China, through Xinjiang province here where the Tarim Basin is, and into Central Asia. So China profited heavily from the export of silk. They had a complete monopoly over this product, and they were already trading it from the 2nd century BC and onward throughout the Tang and Song dynasties that we're going to be talking about today. So let's go and take a look at our first dynasty. Our first dynasty is going to be the Tang Dynasty. So the Tang Dynasty started from around 618 CE and lasted from around 907 CE. And the Tang Dynasty focused heavily on the arts. They produced porcelain that was a very fine quality. They excelled at poetry. Much of the poetry that was written during the Tang Dynasty focused on the daily life of people living in China. And their main philosophy was rooted in Confucianism, which was a native Chinese philosophy. Confucianism focused on proper moral behavior and etiquette. There was this strong belief in respecting your elders and authority figures. And Confucianism brought unity among the Chinese society and among the Chinese government. It was used as a belief system to provide support and unity among those in power. So the aristocrats and Chinese officials heavily favored Confucianism. And Confucianism also, should be noted, focused on this idea known as merit. So if, for example, you are able to prove yourself and your worth and your intelligence and knowledge through the taking of a civil service exam, this would allow you to move up and be promoted into a position in the Chinese government. So your merit or your ability to prove yourself was shown by your achievements on the civil service test. In addition to that, China also excelled during the Tang Dynasty in terms of transportation and communication networks. Perhaps the biggest project that was built during this time was the Grand Canal. The Grand Canal was used to connect the Yellow River in North China to the Yangtze River in southern China. So this was a major trade route, as well as a source of irrigation for agriculture in the eastern part of China. And then the Grand Canal will have parts added to it throughout the Song Dynasty as well. So remember, for the AP test, the Grand Canal was a huge engineering and technology project that started during the Tang Dynasty and will continue throughout the Song Dynasty. Another major technology and idea that spread during the Tang Dynasty was the idea of paper money and credit. And the important thing to know about paper money and credit is that this idea will spread along the Silk Road, and Muslim Arab merchants will eventually use paper money and the idea of extending credit and trade. And these ideas will also spread eventually to Europe as well. So again, China was, as you could tell, a major source of cultural diffusion. It spread its culture to areas like Korea, Japan, and parts of Southeast Asia, including Vietnam. So if we take a look at some of these important sculptures, you'll notice the camel and horses were very common themes in a lot of the sculptures during the Tang Dynasty. And if we can kind of guess why, it really has to do with the fact that trade along the Silk Road was such an important part of China's economy, that these particular animals that were used along the Silk Road also appeared heavily in their art. And if you notice in some of these statues here, Buddhism also was spreading throughout the Tang Dynasty. Buddhism had already entered into China during the Second Dynasty AD, during the Han Dynasty, but during the Tang Dynasty, later on, it began to gain more followers, to the point where for Chinese Confucians to gain acceptance of Buddhism as a foreign belief, Buddhism eventually evolved into a new belief system known as Chang Buddhism or Zen Buddhism. So again, for Buddhism to be accepted by the Confucian Chinese masses, it had to evolve into a new form of Buddhism known as Chan or Zen Buddhism. And this Buddhism focused heavily on meditation, but it also had some Confucian Chinese ideas that mixed into it. We'll take a look here at the top left. This is, of course, a Buddhist pagoda, which kind of proves the idea that Buddhism was now gaining more acceptance during the Tang Dynasty. And you'll also notice, of course, the Buddhist statues during this time period that were prevalent during the Tang Dynasty, and the use of Chinese coin money and paper money, which will spread along the Silk Road. And these are images of the city of Xi'an. Xi'an, of course, was one of the major trade cities in China that connected along the Silk Road. And of course, this is an image of Xi'an in China. You'll notice, of course, the tall Buddhist pagoda. So cities that laid as crossroads along the Silk Road in China also became kind of melting pots. So if you go to Xi'an today in China, not only will you find Buddhist influence like this pagoda there, but you'll even find that there is a strong Muslim community that lives in this area of China, which kind of shows the mixing and cultural diffusion that took place with individuals that were merchants traveling from Western Asia into China. So the next major dynasty we're going to focus on is the Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty, as you'll notice from this map, it started out very large, dominating most of China by 1100, but it began to shrink around 1140 AD. So just within 40 years, you quickly see how much the Song Dynasty, how quickly it shrunk into a small size here. And this was mainly due to the fact that if you look at the Jin Empire that starts to dominate northern China, the Song Dynasty was starting to lose ground due to the fact that northern nomads began to dominate and take territory from the Song Dynasty. And ultimately, the Song Dynasty will completely disappear by the year 1274 once the Mongols invade China and continue to take more Chinese territory away from the Song Dynasty. So the Song Dynasty, of course, their main belief that dominated their way of life continued to be the native Chinese belief of Confucianism. So the focus on proper Chinese behavior, on respecting your elders, on having filial piety, also known as devotion to your family and devotion to your elders. This continued to be a focus point on China during this time. But one of the other things that remains as well is the civil service test, of course. So the Chinese will continue to practice the use of the civil service test in order to attract qualified and competent individuals within the Chinese government. And China continued, of course, to be harassed by these northern nomadic groups. The Mongols continued to raid the Chinese border along the Great Wall, and the Song Dynasty continued their moves further southward as they continued to lose territory to northern groups. One of the major technologies that I also want to focus on regarding the Song Dynasty is the invention of movable type. So the idea of printing originates in China. Printing was a very big deal because once printing takes hold, books become much cheaper to produce. They no longer will be written by hand and having to take years to produce one single book. Instead, movable type as a form of printing will allow books to be printed in a cheap and very quick way. This will also give access to lower classes the ability to read books now, which will increase literacy among many different social classes within China. And there is kind of a secondary effect to the idea of printing. What many people don't realize is that population will soar from around the year 1000 to around the year 1400, not just in China, but also in Europe. And it really is rooted in the idea of printing. Now, some of you are probably wondering, how in the world can it lead to a higher population? Well, the big reason why is if you're printing more books, especially those that have to deal with scientific knowledge, and especially those dealing with better agriculture and farming practices, that knowledge will spread. And if knowledge and books about farming will spread throughout these areas of Europe and China, people will learn how to farm better, which will lead to more food being produced, which will lead to higher populations because of the more food they're producing. So again, printing leads to more books about farming and agricultural technology, which leads to a lot more food being produced, which leads to a higher population. So as we look forward, we're going to talk a little bit about women and their role in China during this time. So how were women treated throughout China's history? Well, that's a very good question. One can say that China has traditionally been a very patriarchal society. And we know that the word patriarchal, of course, means male dominated. So China did have one exception in terms of women. If you notice here at the top of our slide, this individual known as Wu Zhao, she became China's first and to date only empress during the time of China's history. After the death of her husband, Emperor Gaozhong, she became empress. And she was a very capable ruler, very ruthless towards her enemies, but yet compassionate towards the peasants. And that really helped her stay in power. But I want everyone to realize that just because this moment in China's history during the Song Dynasty, that they have a female ruler, a female empress, this doesn't mean all of a sudden that now Chinese women are going to now have equal rights, or that this idea that rights are going to trickle down from the female empress down to the rest of the population. Wu Zhao did not want to rock the boat. She didn't institute major changes among women or the way men would treat women in China. So essentially, China had one female empress, but China remained still a patriarchal society throughout this time and later on throughout its history. And one of the major things that is known during the Song Dynasty was a practice that was seen as a very cruel practice called foot binding started to become very widely spread during this time period. Now, the legend behind foot binding is rooted in a Chinese emperor during the Tang Dynasty. This Chinese emperor fell in love with a female dancer that happened to have her feet bound. And it started to trend later on as something that Chinese women wanted to do. In other words, if it was good enough for the emperor of China in terms of the woman that he fell in love with that was this female dancer, then it must be good enough for the rest of the population. So men began to have foot binding done to their Chinese women. And foot binding, of course, became known as a very cruel practice. It was very brutal, but it was seen as a status symbol among Chinese women. So if a Chinese woman who was from the noble class hoped to attract someone that was a wealthy Chinese noble, they had to have had foot binding done. But at the same time, some of the Chinese peasant women started to also practice this brutal idea, because if foot binding could be used to attract wealthy Chinese nobles and Chinese wealthy women were doing it, well, Chinese peasant women saw it as an opportunity to also attract wealthy men as well. So it started to also be practiced by some of the Chinese peasant women. But again, it was mainly practiced by elite Chinese women. And Chinese foot binding was also seen, even though it was brutal to have done, it was seen as a very feminine and beautiful idea. Again, Chinese women would have it done. Their feet would become much smaller. Large feet were considered masculine and ugly. So having small feet was seen as something more feminine and more beautiful. So in this black and white image that we see from the early 20th century, we see these young girls that have endured the very brutal practice of foot binding. But we're going to go over how this practice actually took place during the Song Dynasty. So how long did foot binding last throughout China's history? Well, it started around the year 1000 CE, around the Song Dynasty, and it was supposed to have been lasted until only 1911, so close to a little bit over 900 years it was practiced. And even though it was outlawed in 1911, it was still practiced in parts of China, because even though a law in 1911 made it forbidden to practice foot binding, people still practiced it because the law was not enforced. So the reality of it is, it doesn't really start to die out until 1949, when China becomes communist. That's when the law is not only passed, but it's also enforced. So really, Chinese foot binding lasted for about 950 years. From around 1000 to 1949 it lasted. So when did Chinese girls have foot binding done to them? Well, it normally happened to girls as young as 3, but all the way to 11 years of age. And they had to endure the practice for 2 to 3 years, as their feet started to not only become deformed, but as it healed in a deformed way. So typically they would take the feet, warm the feet in water, massage them, trim the toenails of the girl, and eventually crack the 4 small toes, but leave the big toe intact, because if they would have broken the big toe, the girls would not have been able to walk properly, or they would not have been able to maintain balance. So they would break the 4 small toes and bend them around the sole of the foot, wrap the feet in bandages that were made of silk, which they would then replace every few days with a new layer of silk bandaging, and this would go on for 2 to 3 years. So while the toes were being held in place by the silk bandages, they would be healing in a very deformed way, which would make the feet much smaller than they were originally. How big would the feet eventually get to? Only from around 3 inches in length. That's how small the feet would get to after 2 or 3 years of enduring this process. So here we actually see how small the feet are. And of course, in this very gruesome image here, we see the toes that are under the sole of the foot there. So here we see a normal foot. And here we see what the feet would look like after the toes have curled back under the sole and as they've been allowed to heal in a deformed way. And here we see this young Chinese girl in the turn of the century, during the 20th century, having her shoes, the special shoes that she's wearing. These special shoes, by the way, they're called lotus shoes. And notice the feet are only about 3 inches in length. Now we're going to look at some interesting photos. Here we see, of course, a normal foot. And here we see a foot that is, of course, that has endured foot binding. So this was a very dangerous practice. Women could die from this. They could get infections. They could get blood poisoning. And again, this was a very cruel practice, which, by the way, as you notice, is just another method to reinforce Chinese patriarchal ideas. Now, how did Confucianism feel about this? Well, Confucianism supported foot binding because, again, Confucianism was always about superior over inferior. And if we think about Confucianism, it's always respecting your authority figure. So women were expected to respect their husbands. So Chinese foot binding reinforced this idea of patriarchy and the respect that husbands deserved. Here, of course, we'll continue to see some of the deformed feet of foot binding. This one is particularly gruesome. But this, by far, ladies and gentlemen, shows the cruel practice of foot binding. Notice how the heel is healed in a very deformed way, and you notice how the toes have curled up. Notice how the skin is blackened, right, due to the poor circulation there in the feet. Here's our last photo showing how cruel the practice of foot binding was. So a new belief formed around the year 1000 during the Tang Dynasty, and that belief is known as Neo-Confucianism. The word neo, of course, is new, along with the word Confucianism. And Neo-Confucianism was a new form of Confucianism that essentially combined the Confucian ideas of filial piety and devotion and loyalty to your parents and family, and the idea of proper behavior and the civil service test, along with the ideas of Buddhism and the ideas of the afterlife, karma, reincarnation, and nirvana. So on the AP test, if you ever encounter Neo-Confucianism, just know it as a combination of both the politics and morality of Confucianism, along with the beliefs of spirituality in the afterlife of Buddhism. So here we are taking a look at Japan. So Japan is an island country off the coast of Korea and China. It is made up of 4 main islands: the northern island of Hokkaido, the main island of Honshu, and the 2 southern islands of Shikoku and Kyushu. These islands are known as an archipelago or a chain of islands, right? And at the same time, Japan was known for being mountainous and volcanic. So there is a large amount of earthquakes and tsunamis that Japan suffers from. And it also has a shortage of fertile lands due to the fact that it is so mountainous. The Japanese have to take advantage of what little fertile land they have. So they're not going to waste it on having large animals like cows or pigs throughout much of their land. Instead, they're going to mainly use their land for rice cultivation. And most of their protein will revolve around their surrounding seas. So they'll get much of their protein through seafood, through fish that are in the Sea of Japan, as well as in the Pacific Ocean. So if we take a look here with Japan, you'll notice that all of the colors that are on this map of the islands of Japan represent various noble families that lived on the island. And that's going to play a big role later on in Japan, because Japan starts out as being a very centralized sort of power, with all power being in the hands of the emperor, much like China was early on. And that's going to quickly change over time as these noble families take more power from the emperor, creating a more decentralized atmosphere in Japan. So the main religion of Japan is the Shinto faith. Now, the Shinto religion is a form of polytheism. That means poly meaning that they believe in many gods. And the sort of polytheism that Shinto is, it's known as animism. And animism is a form of polytheism where people worship spirits in nature or animal spirits. So this was a big thing in Japan in terms of them focusing on forces of nature as their gods. And they used to call their gods, or the spirits in nature, they used to call them the kami, K-A-M-I. And again, this is a polytheistic religion that focuses on animism or nature worship. And this religion of Shinto in Japan also focused heavily on obedience and proper behavior. So what makes Shinto unique is that it is the native religion of Japan. No other country on earth practices Shinto. Only the Japanese do. And if you do find it practiced outside of Japan, it's only among Japanese immigrant communities that practice the religion. And at the heart of their religion, out of all of their kami and out of all of their gods, is Amaterasu. Amaterasu is the main god in the Shinto faith, and she is known as the sun goddess. And it's kind of ironic because if you've ever seen a picture of the flag of Japan, it's basically a white flag with a large dot that is reddish or orangish in color on the flag of Japan, and that's representing the sun. And that really represents the main goddess of Japan, which is Amaterasu, the sun goddess. And it's kind of funny because when you really think about many early civilizations that were polytheistic or that worship many gods, the sun god typically played a prominent role in Aztec mythology, Mayan mythology, as well as ancient Egyptian mythology. And in this case, the sun goddess also played a role in Japanese mythology. And here we see Amaterasu, the sun goddess on the left here. And the sun goddess was also seen as the creator of Japan. The way the story goes is that the Sun goddess dipped a large spear into the ocean, and 4 drops came off of the tip of the spear, creating the 4 islands of Japan. It's also believed that all of the emperors of Japan are descended from the sun goddess. So these emperors were seen as divine because they descended from the sun goddess. On the top right, we also see Shinto priests, who are the main practitioners and mediators in the religion. And the most famous example of the symbol of Shinto are these buildings. These are called torii gates. They supposedly symbolize the pathway from the real world into the spirit world. So whenever you pass under a torii gate, you're entering into the spirit world. And typically we see these torii gates as entrances into Shinto shrines or temples. And here's one of the most famous places in Japan, Mount Fuji. It is believed that the kami reside or dwell on top of Mount Fuji. So Japan eventually started morphing into what we call into the feudal era. But a little bit that I want to mention before Japan enters the feudal era is the role that the emperor played in early Japan. So starting around the 6th century, the Yamato family began to rule Japan as one dynastic family. And it is believed again that the emperors of Japan were descended from the sun goddess. So these emperors ruled with divine power. Now, the biggest influence on the Japanese government and on the Japanese emperor was China itself. China kind of served as the big brother in East Asia for the surrounding countries around it. So in terms of cultural diffusion, China heavily influenced Korea and Japan. And in the case of Japan, what was taken through cultural diffusion and that influenced China into Japan was that the Japanese copied from China the religion of Buddhism. They copied Confucianism, except for the civil service test. That was the only thing that they did not copy from Confucianism. They also very much borrowed the Chinese language characters, which ended up being evolved into the Japanese kanji characters in Japanese writing. And Japanese architecture also made its way from China to Japan. We also see that the Japanese also copied tea from China. So tea was brought over from China to Japan, as well as the ability to produce silk was also copied from China into Japan. One of the biggest things politically that was copied from China was the centralized form of government that the Japanese emperors, copied from the Chinese emperors. This started with the Taika reforms, where the Japanese emperor copied over from China this system of ruling, which was a centralized form of government. All of this kind of devolved, though, by the year 1000. By this point in time, very powerful aristocratic families that were basically warrior families began to take away influence from the Japanese emperor. And the way these noble aristocratic Japanese families did it was by marrying some of their family members into the emperor's family. So by creating marriage alliances, these powerful aristocratic families were able to take and lessen the power of the emperor. And the most important medieval aristocratic Japanese family that ended up taking power was the Minamoto family. And their chief head of the family was known as Yoritomo Minamoto. And by the year 1192, he took on the title of shogun or chief general. And the emperor basically awarded him this power. So we start seeing this transition by the 1100s where the emperor is just a figurehead while the shogun becomes the real power in Japan politically. And below them were the samurai class. The samurai class fulfilled the role of the warriors of Japan. We'll come back to talk more about the samurai in a bit. But first, I want to show you this. This is the example of the social hierarchy in Japan. At the head, we see the emperor, who is more of a figurehead. He's more of the head of the Shinto religion. Think of the emperor by the 1100s fulfilling the role of almost like a pope, like what we see in Europe, in Japan now. The shogun fulfilled the role of almost as a king. He was the chief general or ruler of Japan. Below him were the daimyo. Now, how did this feudal relationship work between the shogun and the daimyo? The shogun would award land to the daimyo in return for loyalty and protection that the daimyo would give. This is not unlike the feudalism that we see in Europe between the king and his lords or nobles. Now, the daimyo would award some land to the samurai in return for loyalty and protection. So the samurai acted as almost like the knights or warriors of Japan, and in return, they served the daimyo in return for loyalty and protection. So we see that the feudal system of Japan very much parallels that of Europe's. Now, the one key difference is that they didn't learn feudalism from each other. There was no cultural diffusion at this time in the 1100s between Europe and Japan. So they came up with feudalism completely on their own, independently. Then we see at the bottom of the samurai now, we see the Ronin. The Ronin were masterless samurai. They did not have a daimyo that they followed. So the Ronin very much were trying to do as much as they could in trying to prove their worth so that a daimyo would retain them or hire them as a samurai. Now, on the other side of the social hierarchy now, we see towards the bottom, the farmers, the artisans, and the merchants. And at the very bottom are the eta. Now, how would this be different from the European style of feudalism? Well, farmers would actually be at the bottom of European feudalism and merchants would be somewhere at the top. Farmers were seen, though, as valuable in Japan because they provided rice and they helped feed the warrior class. Artisans helped produce things such as swords for the warrior class. The merchants were at the very bottom. The reason why merchants were at the bottom is even though merchants could become very wealthy in Japan, they were seen socially at the bottom of their ladder. And it had to do a lot with the introduction of Buddhism that came from China into Japan. Buddhism views merchants as people who don't produce anything, who don't contribute. All they do is profit from the production of other people. So they're very much looked down upon within Japanese society. At the very bottom are the eta. The eta were seen as outcasts. They are basically a group made up of people who had deformities or handicaps, also people that were criminals, as well as prostitutes. All of those fell into the eta class. So comparing European knights to Japanese samurai. So they both shared similar political structures, social structures, and an honor code. Now, the honor code of the European knight was known as chivalry, where they had to show loyal and courage to their lords. The Japanese followed a much stricter code known as the code of Bushido, which means way of the warrior. Now, Japanese samurai had to be loyal to their lords, and if they ever showed dishonor, they would have to commit seppuku or ritual suicide in order to regain their honor and not bring shame onto their families. Now, Japanese were very different from Europeans in terms of how they viewed women. European knights were typically much more open to noble women in terms of giving them certain rights. They viewed them as more beautiful and possessing feminine traits. European women were adored compared to Japanese samurai. The Japanese samurai basically held women to a very low standing. Women in Japan lived harsher, more demeaning lives compared to those in Europe at the time. Now, European feudalism also revolved around a contract where both the lord and the knights mutually agreed upon the stipulations that were between them. While in Japan, there was no written contract. Instead, it was this idea of group identity and loyalty that everybody just understood and followed. So here we see an image of the samurai, how they would have looked wearing their armor, much lighter armor made of lacquer and leather compared to the European knights who dressed up in metal armor. Here we see the use of the samurai sword or katana sword, which was the primary weapon of the Japanese samurai. Japanese samurai also used the longbows, and they also used the naginata or Japanese spear. Here we see an image of the Japanese katana sword, which the samurai used. You see the Japanese samurais dressed up for battle. So we notice that by the 1100s, Japanese society became a very militaristic society that revolved around this warrior class. And here we see the Japanese samurai on horseback, very similar to European knights fighting on horseback. Lastly, we see Japanese noblewomen. Notice how they're wearing silk robes. Silk, of course, was something that was diffused from China to Japan. Notice the Japanese style architecture, the slanted roofs, very much copied from China. Here we see Minamoto Yoritomo, the first shogun of Japan. And here we notice, of course, the Japanese daimyo on horseback and the influence here of Buddhism coming from China to Japan in the sense of their architecture. And one of the major events that happened in Japan was when, on two separate occasions in the 1200s, when the Mongols under Kublai Khan's reign tried to invade and conquer Japan. On these two occasions, the Mongols were not successful. On both occasions, a Japanese storm known as a typhoon destroyed the Mongol invasion ships. And they ended up calling these storms that ended up defeating the Mongol armies as the kamikaze storms or divine wind storms. What was Korea like during the time of the Middle Ages? Well, Korea was very much influenced by China. China, again, was the main diffuser of culture in this part of the world of East Asia. So Korea copied from China the ideas of Buddhism that entered in starting around the 5th century, as well as Confucianism, which also made its way from China to Korea. Now, the Koreans copied everything in terms of Confucianism except for the civil service test. Chinese language also filtered into Korea, and the Chinese characters were used in Korean language until the 1100s. Another major influence was Chinese architecture. The slanted roofs that we see in Korean buildings were very much influenced by Chinese architecture. Now, Korea politically was a vassal state of China for much of its history. That means it owed its allegiance to the Chinese emperor. In other words, when we really think about Korea politically, it was a puppet state to what China was. So in other words, the Chinese emperor had the main way of directing Korean affairs. They were basically overseeing Korea politically, where Korea had to pay tribute and provide gifts to China in return. So this made Korea what we know as a vassal state, or a country that serves another state. So Korea essentially served China for much of its history. Here we see the Korean style architecture. Notice the pagodas that were very much influenced from China in terms of architecture, as well as the Buddhist influence that came from China. Now, India was the main country that diffused culture throughout South Asia. Now, for much of its history, India was Hindu. From the year 1000 BC, all even to today, the main religion of India was Hinduism. Hinduism, of course, focused on a very strict social hierarchy that revolved around the caste system. This began to change starting by the year 1000 when Muslim invaders started raiding India from the Middle East. And by the year 1200, these Muslim invaders formed their own empire within India known as the Delhi Sultanate. And this is a major game changer for India because now we see that India, which was a predominantly Hindu country, is going to have Islamic rulers ruling over them. So now we start to see this blend of Hinduism remaining among the majority of the population, with the rulers being Islamic or Muslim. And now we see a new religion being introduced to India at this point, which is the religion of Islam. And if we look at today, India is still predominantly Hindu, with about 800,000 people practicing Hinduism today, but there are over 200 million people in India that are Muslim. So because of this invasion, starting in the year 1000, and by the time the Delhi Sultanate forms their empire in 1200, this creates Islam to be the second most important religion in India today. So when the Muslims bring their religion to India, they just don't bring their religion, they also bring their educational system. So colleges begin to form during the Delhi Sultanate. The Muslims also build irrigation or canal networks in India. And we start to see that mosques start to be built in India. So Muslim temples called mosques are also going to be built. Now, the Muslims were very offended by the Hindu population and their religion. They found polytheism to go against the strong monotheism that Islam preached. So they will try to do everything they can to try to get the Hindu population to convert. And at first, they were harassing and at first they were burning Hindu temples, but eventually they allowed many of the Hindus to keep their religion as long as they paid the jizya or tax, which is very similar to the Christians and Jews that were in the Middle East that were allowed to keep their religion as long as they paid the jizya. So here's a comparison between Hinduism and Islam in India. Hindus are polytheistic, while Muslims are monotheistic. Hindus uphold the caste system, while Muslims believe all people are equal under God. For Hindus, cows are sacred. For Muslims, cows are food. Hindus are universal and exclusive in terms of their religion, while Muslims are tolerant of other beliefs. And here we see some of the evidence of Islam when it arrived, starting in the year 1000, and by the time they set up their empire in 1200 under the Delhi Sultanate. Notice this Islamic tomb, right? Notice the sarcophagus that's built there in India, the Islamic architecture that's being diffused in India here, the use of Islamic coins in India. Notice this, the writing is of that style, and Islamic architecture begins to spread. And during our next lesson, we'll be talking about the Mongols. So be ready for that in our next lesson. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great day, everybody.